Hey everybody, it's Professor Parish. Sorry about this video being so late this week. I meant to have it out on Monday and I was not feeling well, and then last night I was trying to play catch up and didn't quite get to make this video. And if I'm going to make this lecture video, I want it to be enthusiastic and energetic and I want to give it my all. And last night I had a lot going on, so I just couldn't get to it. But tonight, Wednesday night, you are getting a lecture video. And we are in the midst of poetry. We have things to look at. We have things to talk about with your papers. We have a totally new assignment, things going on this week. Spring break is around the corner. Things are getting crazy. And I want to talk with with all of you about those things tonight. So, strap in, have fun, and we are going to go through our next segment of poetry and talk about week 8, my lucky number. Alright, so let me make myself smaller. Yay! Alright, so as far as this week goes, I want to go first to our course content and talk about that and what we are doing this week in the course. So if I go to course content here, scroll down, we're already to week 8. It's midterm. Can you believe that? All right, week 8. We have a couple of assignments due this week. You will notice, first and foremost, there is no discussion forum this week. As I said in our introduction video, we only have 15 discussion forums in this class because math and how the points round out in this class. So we don't have a discussion forum this week. This week just happens to work out to be one where we don't need a discussion forum. So instead, we have a grammar checkup. So if I click on that, our grammar checkup, we've not done a lot with grammar in this class, which is fine, but I want to show you what all it looks like. It's just a basic review of grammar, nothing crazy. It's very similar to what you did in the grammar sampler in week 1. Just a little bit different. The main thing that is different is at the end we have our MLA review. So I'm asking you at the very end to tell me what is the formula if you are citing a print book and if you're citing a web page or web article. And if you have watched the MLA presentation in week 5, which you should have, then you will know the answer to these questions. If you have not watched the week 5 video, I would probably go do that. I would go check that video out and that presentation out in our resources page before completing this last section. The in-text citation review, you are just telling me if I have a book with one author and the author is not listed in the sentence of the in-text citation, what does the in-text citation look like? Again, numbers 18 through 21, they are in that presentation. So go back and check that out. I just want to know the formula of what goes in these parentheses and how you would cite this type of source. Okay? Everything else in the grammar review is all just things we've gone over before in the sampler. So you should be all right. But I went extremely lenient on the MLA in our grammar sampler. I will not be doing that on this because MLA is going to become a big part of our second half of the semester. So I want to make sure that we all start out on a good foot. So if you have questions, let me know. But the grammar checkup is one of the assignments for this week, and it's due Sunday. The other assignment is reading response number 3, which is also due Sunday. So you don't have any Friday assignments due. You get off on just completing assignments for Sunday. So the reading response number 3 is having to do with this very first set of glossy pages, which we talked about last week, and it starts on the end of page 698. So you're basically choosing 2 image poem combinations, 2 poems that have images with them, and you are sort of comparing and contrasting how they're similar, how they're different. Do they represent the poems that match? If you just follow the directions, you'll be fine. So your answers must be in paragraph form, in complete sentences. You would organize this as if it were a mini essay with a short introduction of maybe 1 or 2 sentences and a short conclusion. So if you don't organize your information right on this reading response, I will take off points. So just make sure that you're meeting the guidelines and you should be good. I really like this assignment because I feel like everyone chooses a different poem image combination, and their reasoning behind their questions is always interesting, because I think even if people choose the same 2 poem images, their reasoning of what it means or what the purpose of the poem is seems to be different. So I like that. But again, reading response, grammar checkup, those are the only 2 assignments this week in week 8. Obviously, watch this video that is being posted Wednesday night instead of Tuesday. We are going to go over chapters 16 through 18 tonight, and obviously continue working on paper 2. I finally got through all of your outlines. That's what I did last night to catch up, and they're great. I was really impressed with your outlines. I honestly think paper 2 is usually the paper that students get confused or frustrated on because it is set up different than any type of paper you've probably experienced up until this point. But to be honest, and I've probably noted it in your outlines, I was really impressed with how everyone has organized their thoughts, how they've organized their points. I think all the points work. If for some reason they didn't, I would have noted it, but unless I said otherwise, your outlines look fantastic, and they only make me more excited to read your papers. So thumbs up, 2 thumbs up to you all for doing awesome and making some really good outlines. I'm excited for paper 2, and I still have to wait a week and a half. It's only Wednesday. So optional this weekend. I know a lot of you have already done these, but if you want to revise paper 1, that is due Sunday as well. Just email me your revisions by Sunday night and you can get a improved grade on paper 1. So if you don't want to revise paper 1, it's okay. Don't worry about it. But some of you I have recommended that you do revise, and others I've been like, if you got an A on paper 1, you're probably okay. I do have some students that are perfectionists, and they're like, no, I got a 93. I need a 100. I'm like, okay, it is your revision. You do what you want. But those are the only 2 assignments due by Sunday this week, so should be a pretty laid back week. Next week is the week before spring break, and I will go into more detail about this over the weekend. Obviously, I'm going to try to get the video for week 9 out by Sunday, but we're going to finish talking about poetry. We're going to talk about paper 2 and talk about the discussion forum. You have an exam for poetry. It is not showing up yet. I will likely, by the time I'm doing the week 9 video, that poetry exam will be up for you to take. So just kind of keep on the lookout for the week 9 video next week, and we should be good. But yeah, you'll notice on spring break, there's no assignments for spring break. Yay! I did have on here to go ahead and work on week 10 if you want. I do want to let you all know, and I'll remind everybody next week in week 9, over spring break, IT is going to be doing some maintenance, mainly to my SIC. It's not really on the students' end. It's more for faculty like myself. So there will be, we won't have a lecture video for week 10, obviously, because it would just be me going, have fun on spring break. But there will be some maintenance, so my SIC will be down from March 11th. They say it'll be up by March 13th, but I don't know. So just plan on my SIC being shut down from March 11th to March 15th. Just plan on that. So you won't be able to get on your online class during that time. And you may not be able to get onto your email for a couple of days over spring break. So I just wanted to give you guys a heads up. I will know more about it next week when we talk about week 9, but just kind of keep that in the back burner for right now. So yeah, the only 2 assignments that are due Sunday are the grammar checkup, reading response, work on paper number 2 because it will be due next week, and we should be good, right? All right, I did want to address a question that a student had asked me, and that was, if you're doing option number 2, how do you add pictures into your document? Which is a very, very good question. So if you chose to do option 2 for the poetry paper and you're writing poems on 2 of your pictures that you've taken yourself or 2 pictures you've gotten off the internet, then what you'll do, and I'll pull up this Word document, this is online Word, but if you have Word installed on your computer, it's going to be about the same buttons. So what you want to do is first go to Insert, and you'll have the picture option. Now your picture does need to be saved onto your computer. I hope you're not typing this paper out on your phone. That would be a lengthy process. But you could also upload from your phone, I suppose. But you'll go to Picture. You will go from this device. And then you will go to Browse. I'm going to choose this adorable picture of my dog, Ruby. And pick Open. And Insert. And it's going to insert the picture into your document. Okay, there we are. There's the picture of little Ruby. So once you have the picture in, what you want to do is you want to click on the picture, and you'll notice that this little picture, if you're using Word on the computer, it might say formatting, but it will pop this up. And my best suggestion is this whole wrap text here, you want to make sure that that says square. I usually do square right. And that will allow you not only to make the picture smaller by going to the right hand, but it will also let you move the picture around. So if I do it here, also let me move it around. I'm going to not lock aspect ratio, cut down, and then it will allow me to move it wherever I want to and then type next to it. So this is Ruby. All right. So yeah, that is basically how to insert a picture into your paper if you're doing option 2. And you can play around with it and see, like this little thing up here is asking if you want to turn it to the side, spin it around, do what you want. You can like angle certain pictures certain ways. But yeah, that's basically the idea behind it, is that you are inserting a picture if you did option number 2. And if you have questions about it, feel free to ask me. I'll be happy to kind of walk you through it again if you're having trouble, if things aren't working out the way you want to. But with that being said, as far as inserting photos goes, let's dive in to part 2 of our presentation. This is on your resources, chapter 16, 17, and 18. You'll notice that this presentation covers all of our remaining chapters. We're only going to go through half of them today. And so we're only going to go through slides 1 through 7 before we start. So, chapter 16, I talked about this image earlier in previous weeks, but I really like it. It is the image of the tree trunk with all of the roots coming down. And I love that because the whole idea of symbolism is that there is meaning beneath the surface. And that is, this chapter is very much an extension of what we've talked about with symbolism in fiction. So an allegory is our first term with symbolism that we see, and it is actually, if you scroll through our pages here, it starts out talking about allegory. We get a few poems in, and then all the way, the terms actually start later in this chapter for symbolism. It's way back as I'm scrolling through past the glossy pages, the second set of glossy pages, actually. Maybe I missed it. But we have allegory. Is it on page 740? Oh my goodness. Can't find the term in the book. So allegory is a term that is talked about in our text, and that's basically a set of symbols that work together to create a pattern throughout. And places and colors can have double meaning, names can have double meaning, seasons can have double meaning. Pretty much anything the poet wants to utilize can have a double meaning. It's really up to the reader to interpret what that extra meaning is. And on page 762, we have our second set of glossy images. And I actually like this set more than I do the first set of glossy images, although I do like bananas and grapefruit. But on page 762, you can see Edward Hopper's Nighthawks is actually one of my favorite paintings. It's actually in the Chicago Museum of Art. You all should go see it sometime. It's not a big painting, but it's very good. But there is a Nighthawks poem that Sue Standing wrote to go along with that painting. And a lot of these are just based on either paintings or sculptures, or From Above is a really good one. It's the fourth one. And then The Great Figure, Girls on a Bridge, Jackson Pollock's Frenzied Movement, and Under the Wave of Kanagawa is on there as well. So I would check out those poems as well, because I think that they match up with the pictures in more interesting ways than the first set does. And there's a lot of poetry in this chapter that talks about symbolism, talks about extra meaning, and there's tons of examples in here. I mean, we've got John Keats as an example. We have Lucille Clifton. There's just a lot to go through, so I highly encourage you to skim through this chapter, look at what poems are present. And then after the glossy images, you'll also see like a little excerpt about each of those poems and their corresponding image. So there's not a whole lot to talk about with the symbolism chapter that we haven't already discussed in fiction. I wish I could find the page that allegory's on. That's kind of driving me crazy, guys. Oh, 757! I found it! Oh, it was going to drive me crazy if I couldn't see it. 757 starts juxtapositions and talks about symbolism and allegory. So turn to page 757 and you will see it. I had it earmarked and I must have flipped the earmark back, because there it is, 757, right before we get to the glossy images. So, yay! I'm glad I found that. But yeah, there's not a whole lot of differences or extra terminology that we haven't already discussed with fiction. Just be aware that symbolism is extremely important in poetry. It's extremely important to create those double meanings so that your audience gets multiple themes and meanings out of the poems themselves. Now, chapter 17, we make up for in terms of terminology. It's all about words, and our chapter starts with that big word cluster there. And there's a lot to go through in this chapter. But on page 774, our chapter starts talking about lots of different things. So basically talking about how poets use language. The first thing they note is that poets are sticklers for the right word, which is exactly very, very, very much true. If you're writing a haiku, you are limited to a 5-7-5 syllable poem. So picking the right word is extremely important, because you want to fit that pattern and make it work, but also be creative and interesting. You can't be really repetitive with poetry unless it's intentional. Whereas in fiction, you can be repetitive quite a bit and your reader doesn't notice. In a poem, your reader's going to pick up if you keep using the same words, and it will show you're not being creative enough or using elaborate enough vocabulary that needs to be used. So you have to basically pick and choose your words very carefully with poetry. Poets have a keen ear for the emotional quality of words. So they understand the difference between connotation, which we talked about in fiction is the emotional meaning, and denotation, which is the direct meaning. So a poet has to constantly be aware of what they want their audience to understand emotionally and what they want their audience to understand literally. So like Robert Frost stopping by woods on a snowy evening, Frost is using the denotation of a literal man on horseback riding through the woods in his poem, but the connotation in the last couple of lines of "there are miles to go before I sleep, miles to go before I sleep," the emotional meaning behind that isn't just that he's worried about getting home, it's he's worried about the things that he has left to do in his life. So it's a little bit of difference there, and a poet has to be aware of if they're using the connotation or the denotation when they use certain types of words or phrases. Poets have a keen ear for differences in tone. you should be able to, if you're a poet, when you read a poem, understand exactly what the tone is. Is it sad? Is it happy? Is it sarcastic? Is it biting? Is it soft? And a good poet will know that when you read the poem. And you can kind of pick up on it when you read poetry out loud. You can be like, oh, well, this poem seems happy, but there's something off about it. Like, it seems maybe it's darker, or more like maybe sardonic or crude. And poets, you can pick that up if you read a poem out loud. Archaic language is tied to having a keen ear, understanding when you're dealing with archaic language. That is language that's outdated. So we've talked about Shakespeare, and we will talk about Shakespeare a lot more when we get into drama. Shakespeare is a beloved classic genius writer. He did poetry, he did drama. He's just, I mean, he's famous for a reason. His work is just that good. But I feel like the more time goes on, a lot of this current generation, and a lot of people in my generation, really don't care too much for Shakespeare. And I honestly think it's not because of the content. It's not because of the stories or the poems themselves. It's because the language is archaic. If you are an English major, or if you major in language or grammar, you'll eventually learn about where English originates from, how it's developed over the centuries. You'll get to see how Middle English becomes Middle Old English, becomes old, how Old English becomes kind of Middle Old English to Middle English to New English to the standard we have now. It's a constantly evolving process, and there's a lot of words and phrases that we don't use now because it's just been outdated and replaced. Thou, thine, thy. We don't use those words in our everyday language anymore. They are archaic. An opposite example of that is the word ain't. Ain't is actually an Old English word because the AI, the ein, was an original form of is in Old English. And when people started migrating over from England to the United States, the ein word kind of became a status for lower class citizens. So people who are more rural or were not like upper class rich people, but still use the word ain't, whereas the upper crust society with their monocles and so, they kind of dropped the word ain't and stuck with isn't. So that's kind of where that word's come from, and the American Standard of English doesn't really recognize ain't as an official word, but in the last couple of years, the Webster Dictionary has acknowledged, yeah, it's a word. We just kind of were elitist for a while and dumped it to the side. But if you're in high school, don't try to use ain't in a paper because you'll likely be in trouble. And don't say Miss Parish said it was okay, because I'll be like, no, I'm not guilty, I swear. Poets have a keen ear for the sounds of words. So there's 3 terms here that talk about those sounds. So the first is, if you see Dr. Rice, our president at SIC on campus, he used to be my speech coach, and when I was at SIC, and his favorite word, he said, was onomatopoeia. So if you ever see him, you'll have to be like, is your favorite word onomatopoeia? But he always told us that was his favorite word. And they are words that sound like they are spelled. So we have a ton of them in the English language. We have buzz, stomp, hit, scratch, punch. Pretty much any kind of action verb has an onomatopoeia sound to it. Buzz, hiss, woof, like any sounds that are words could have onomatopoeic qualities to them. These terms will be on your exam, so make sure that you understand those. Poetic diction and circumlocution are 2 different terms that describe types of language. So poetic diction is exactly the opposite of archaic language. Poetic diction is the more refined and elegant speech that's used more so than normal conversation. So in poetry, you might use terminology that is a little bit more flowery or poetic or elegant than a normal conversation. And we see this happening in other genres as well. I would argue Stephen King, the author, he uses a lot of diction. I think a lot of criticism against his writing is that conversations between characters sometimes don't sound natural, or they sound like words that older adults would use instead of kids. So, and M. Night Shyamalan, who writes screenplays, gets this criticism as well, because a lot of his movies, the dialogue is like, people don't talk like that. But that's just his style, so, you know, you just go with it. But poetic diction is very much like that. It's a very flowery, elegant, refined speech, much more so than normal conversation. And then circumlocution is a phrase that quote-unquote takes the long way around in its meaning. So if you said, oh, that's my place of primary residence. Okay, your place of primary residence is also known as your home. So it's just a very long, elegant way of saying something. I actually had a student one time that in a class we were writing resumes. And on his resume he wrote that he was an Italian cuisine preparer and transporter. And I was like, that sounds pretty fancy. He was a pizza delivery guy. I figured that out when he put Domino's by his Italian cuisine preparer and transporter. I was like, man, way to sell yourself on your resume, though. I was like, I would probably hire you because you were that creative. I'd be like, yeah, I want that guy. I like his style. But that's circumlocution. And a lot of poets will use circumlocution to make their poetry seem more elegant and refined, and also seem like it has poetic diction as well. So these three terms here, make sure that you are familiar with them for the exam. There are on page 775 to 776 some poems that use examples from poetic diction, circumlocution, and onomatopoeia. Be sure to go over those as well. All right, dialect is ways to tell where the poet is from, or it creates a setting for a poem. A lot of times poems don't focus on setting. They don't say this poem takes place in a forest in the middle of Virginia. They just don't. They're not like fiction. They just dive right into a moment, and you are meant to just kind of imagine where that moment takes place. Sometimes, though, the poet will give clues to the reader to let them know where the poem is taking place at, or at what time period. And that is what we call dialect. So on page 795, for example, we have Hugh MacDiarmid's Weep and Wail No More. And I'm going to read this out loud to you all and see if you can kind of catch an idea of what this is. So, stop killing the deed. Gear hour your weeping and wailing. Ya maun keep quiet, if you want to hear them still, and no blur their image in your mind. For they've only a faint wee whisperin' voice, making nae mair noise ava, than growin' of the grass that flourishes where nobody walks. Did you notice my voice was doing that? I wasn't trying to have an accent, but where naebody walks. Where naebody walks. It's Irish, right? Or Scottish in this case. It's a Scottish dialect. So the poet is writing with a Scottish dialect to help the reader understand where this poem takes place at. So, like, where naebody is like where nobody, if we were saying it. A faint wee whisperin'. A wee whisperin'. That's Scottish for sure. And then, killin' the deed, jeer hour, ya weepin' and wailin'. I mean, it's just the dialect makes you read it in a certain way, and it makes your voice inflect in a certain way. And so that would tell me, okay, this poem is Scottish. The poet is Scottish, or it takes place in Scotland. So you can do things like that if you want to put the words y'all or ain't in a poem, or clip words, or say warsh. My mother says warsh, and it drives me crazy. I'm like, wash does not have an R in it. But she says it like it does. So, like if you say it's warsh, or ain't, or it, or y'all, then your reader will probably guess that this poem is written in a southern region, or by a southern writer. So, you can use dialect to give your readers an idea of setting. And then we have alliteration. Alliteration is my favorite term of poetry, maybe my favorite term in any language genre. The repetition of the same sound at the beginning of several words in the same line. So when I was on the speech team, we would do exercises to get your vocal cords and your mouth all stretched out before you gave a speech. So we'd always do one that would be like, she sells seashells by the seashore. That is alliteration. Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers. That's alliteration. Even Ron Burgundy in Anchorman does alliteration. He'd be like, how now, brown cow? The Human Torch was denied a bank loan. That one's not so much alliteration. But the Peter Piper picked a peckle pickle peppers, she sells seashells by the seashore, they all have that same repetition of sound, and that is alliteration. I would highly recommend alliteration when you are writing titles for your papers, because it's catchy and it's easy to do. So if my paper was about alligators, I would be like, amazing alligators abound. I just made that up. Or if I was doing it, I'd be like, poetic terminology and pickled precision, or something like that. I don't know, making those up. But the idea is that you have that repetition, and it's creative, it's fun, and a lot of poets like to use it because of those reasons. But yeah, so you can kind of look through here and see some more examples of these terms in action within the poems that we're looking at. Alliteration is on page 798, by the way. And we kind of have with Lost Tribe an example of alliteration as well. So, yeah. Fun stuff with words, right? Lots of word terminology. Our last chapter for this presentation is going to be about rhyme, meter, and stanza in the form. And I like that our picture for form is a fern, because that makes a lot of sense. The form is the structure of the poem. It's the way that the patterns and rhymes all are put together, how the poem comes together in terms of it being formatted. And there's lots of different terms that we can go over here in this last part of our presentation today. The first is end rhyme. So end rhyme is what we normally think of when we see a poem. It's the last word of each line rhyming. So you can kind of see that on the hunter, where we have the hunter crouches in his blind, neath camouflage of every kind. So blind, kind, and then it goes on with noise, decoys, which is kind of a half rhyme, as we talked about last week. Pluck, luck, duck. So you get the idea. The rhyming is all at the end of the line. And that's normally what we think of when we think of poetry. However, sometimes poems can have what we call internal rhymes, where the rhymes are within the line of the verse instead of at the end. So on page 811, you can kind of see this coming together in the middle of page 11 there, where it says, all is seared with trade, bleared, smeared with toil. So that seared, bleared, smeared are all rhyming words within the middle of a line instead of at the end. So if you're writing your own poem, for any of the options for paper 2, you can incorporate any of these types of forms to use in your own poems. If you're writing option 2 and you're having trouble kind of identifying the poems that you've written in the terms, go through these 3 chapters. Go through symbolism, words, and form, because there's a lot of words here that you can use in your analysis to talk about the poems you've created. Closed couplets is coming after our review of meter and stanza. Closed couplets are 2 lines of self-containing rhymes. And I'm trying to think where on here we have closed couplets featured. And that's on page 809. I'm backtracking a little. Page 809 talks about closed couplets that we see in Jonathan Swift's A Description of the Morning. That's where you have specifically 2 lines where each of the rhymes are contained. So if you look on page 810 there, you have, now hardly here and there a hackney coach appearing showed the ruddy morn's approach. Now Betty from her master's bed had flown, and softly stole to decompose her own. So you can see the pattern there on the side of Swift's poem on page 810, where it's like AA, BB, CC, DD, EE, and so on and so forth. That's a closed couplet, where you've got 2 self-containing lines of rhyme. The opposite of that is multiple rhymes, where more than 2 lines are rhyming at the same time. And on page 811, we've got an example from Lord Byron's Don Juan that talks about single, double, and triple rhymes. Now, single, double, and triple rhymes will be on your exam, but what I'm looking for in terms of your answer is something like this. So a single rhyme is where it's one syllable in the rhyming word. So you have like moon, soon. Double rhyme is exactly that, double syllables. So balloon, saloon. And then triple rhyme, which is the hardest, is 3. So extrovert, introvert. So I'm going to ask you on your exam to put down what multiple rhymes mean, which can be just more than 2 lines rhyming. And then I'll ask you for an example of a single, double, and triple rhyme. So you'll need to put something like that. And you should be good. Okay? I have some students try to do things different. They'll be like, they'll put in the masculine, feminine. I'm not worried about that for this assignment. I just want to know, can you do a single rhyme, a double rhyme, and a triple rhyme example out to the side? Okay? So our last slide here is, I think this is our last one. Is it? Nope, we've got 2 slides left. Getting ahead of myself. So we have on, like I said, this chapter here on form has a lot of terms. Assonance is similar to half and slant rhymes. They are actually more of an echo than a rhyme. So like break and fade. Those don't look like they rhyme at all, right? Well, it's all the sound of the vowel. So you have break, a, and you have fade, fade. So it's the same vowel sound on the a and the ea there. That's assonance. Or you have mice and fight. You have mice and fight. You have the I sound on those. So very similar to half and slant rhymes, just a little bit different. Anapest is, we're going back to feet, talking about meter. We've talked about iambic, where in feet an iambic foot is where the second foot is emphasized. In anapest, neither are emphasized. Neither of them. So it's a little different. It's kind of odd, a little weird. On page 815, we talk more about meter and stress. And if you go to 816, there's more example of foot. And then on 817, we have our iambic, trochaic, and anapest. So, like at the bottom of page 817, we have our example of anapest. But his wings will not rest, and his feet will not stay for us. There's not really anything emphasized there. It's just a line of poetry. There's clearly a feet, there's clearly a separation, but there's not really any stress on any of the words. Trochaic and iambic are opposites of each other. Iambic is when the stress is on the second foot. Trochaic is the first foot. And so you can see on page 817 there, we have 2 by Percy Shelley. And we have music, when soft, voices die, vibrates in the memory. Odors, when sweet, violets sicken, live within the sense they quicken. Rose leaves, when the rose is dead, are heaped for the beloved's bed. And so thy thoughts, when thou art gone, love it, self shall I slumber on. So did you notice? There's a little bit of a difference there. Let's look at those last 2 lines. And so, I thought, when thou art gone. So that's iambic because the second word's getting the stress. But look at the line right after it. Love it, self shall slumber on. That love, when it comes out, is instantly getting more stress. That's trochaic. So trochaic and iambic and anapest, kind of, these terms require you to sort of read the poem to really see if it has that stress or not. But which not all poetry is meant to be read aloud. So just be kind of aware of the differences between those terminologies. And then we have our last slide here. I kind of crammed it in there. There are a lot of terms in this chapter I did not go over in this slideshow. If you look on page 818 to 819, there's like hexameters, tetrameters, trimeters. I put pentameters on here because we think penta is means 5. It's just 5 stressed syllables to a line of poetry. But you'll also know on page 819 they have like tetrameter, trimeters, hexameters. There's all sorts of terms here. And any of these terms you can use in your analysis as well. They're all there to give you more options to talk about in terms of how you wrote your poems and how your poems you're analyzing are written. Dactyl is at the top of page 818. That is 2 unstressed syllables after a stressed syllable, so something a little different. Blank verse are unrhymed lines of poetry in a sonnet. So blank verse is used by Shakespeare quite a bit because Shakespeare maybe didn't want to rhyme every single line of poetry in his sonnets. So a lot of his sonnets are just, they're poetic. It's in the sonnet structure of 14 lines, but they don't all have to rhyme, and that's called blank verse. Scrolling down here, these last 3 I would connect if you're doing option 3 and talking about songs. You might want to use 1 or 2 of these terms. If you're doing country music or a folk song or poem in your paper number 2, you could use villanelle, which is just another word for a country or folk song or poem. A popular ballad means that it is a song-like poem that are longer than lyrics. So I always think of either Free Bird by Leonard Skinner or Stairway to Heaven by Led Zeppelin. Those are longer than lyrics, but they're not quite full-blown ballads. They're just like popular pop songs. Even though they're not pop, they're technically like rock or classic rock. But the idea is that they are a ballad. They're not just a lyric. And then you have a literary ballad, which is kind of in the form of a question and answer style lengthy poem. And the best example I could think of that would be the Misty Mountain song that the dwarves sing, say, too, in The Hobbit. So if you've not read The Hobbit, shame on you, you should. Just joking. But if you've not seen the poem The Misty Mountain, it reads like a story, but it's in poetry form. And it's also kind of a song. It's a lot of things at once. But there's a lot of terms in here. You can keep looking. The ballad terminology are on page 823. There's a bit of Shakespeare poetry in here. John Milton's in here. And it goes and talks a little bit more about different types of forms that you encounter in each of the example poems. So hopefully this all made sense. There's a lot of terms to go over, but the reason why I don't go through every single term is at this point with chapter 18, a lot of this are just stylistic choices. They're really just what you stylistically want to include or talk about in your analysis or in your poems. So the ones I've mentioned here will likely be on your exam. So you might want to make notes of those, keep track of what those terms are, but otherwise, this chapter 18 is really a free-for-all for you as the writer to go through and see which terminology you want to highlight with your poems that you're writing. So, yeah. That's all I've got for today. Sorry if that was a little rambly. But, as always, if you guys have any questions about writing paper 2, any questions at all about terminology, about anything, don't hesitate to ask me, all right? I am not traveling this weekend, so I will be home. I can answer your questions. I'll be grading as the week goes on. And then come Sunday night, I should have week 9's video posted, and we'll talk about spring break. And we'll talk about the last week before spring break. So if you got any questions, let me know. Otherwise, I am excited for you all to get to be working on paper number 2. And I will talk to you all soon. All right? Have a great week and weekend, and I'll talk to you later.